Welcome to the Literati Scene with Smoki Bacon and Dick Concannon, and co-hosts Suzanne McDonald and Joanna DiTillo. So stay tuned. Our guest today is Murray Forbes, and he is the head of the Navigator Foundation, which this organization brings forth unappreciated art from Central Europe and Eastern Europe to Boston. He's also an expert in many areas, and one of the areas we're going to talk about today is the recent Scottish referendum vote. If you would explain this before you go into why it didn't go through, okay? That would be for our viewers.
Well, may I begin by saying that I worked in Scotland for 10 years, 2 months a year, in the course of producing the largest collection in North America of 20th century Scottish photography, and then organized an exhibition of this in Boston with the Public Library in 2002 and the Fitchburg Art Museum in 2003. It was called Scotland Calls, and the website is www.scotlandcalls.com. As a result of all of that, it was a project that involved art, but it also involved contact with many people who were experts in history, literature, politics, sociology, everything you can think of. And in the course of 2 months a year for 10 years and a number of trips to Scotland before that, I began to get some idea of various aspects of Scotland.
Well, you are also the head of a clan, aren't you?
I'm not a head of any clan.
Oh, you're not?
That would be a very grand position.
Okay, are you a chieftain?
The valley of the Don, where my family comes from, is rich in salmon at the top, and the land is good, but by the time you get down to where my family came, it's a much smaller river, and there aren't many salmon, and the land is poor. And we were the most junior bunch of people in the chief's family, and that's one reason that we emigrated.
Do you hold any position?
I'm the most junior chieftain of Clan Forbes.
Okay, that was always going.
That's all.
Chieftain.
That's all. But anyway, we've heard a lot about the Scottish referendum, but it's helpful to look at recent history and past history and recognize its connection to something called the Declaration of Arbroath, which is a national holiday in our country on April the 6th, celebrating the Scottish Declaration of the Rights of Nations and Individuals. That all is much involved in the Scottish referendum. Scotland is a small country. It's a country of very few people. For much of its history, it has been comparatively poor. But going back a very long way, you find that this small country with few people and not very many economic resources often, it changed with time, has actually done quite a lot. It began by repelling the Roman Empire, which was a fairly unusual achievement. And it set the borders to the Roman Empire. That's going back a long way. By the time we get to the somewhat entertaining but often terribly misleading and often terribly much a film that omits important things, the film of Braveheart, we come to one of Scotland's major contributions, which changed the balance of power in Europe, and that is the idea of democratic patriotism. And the Scots, who were under very severe pressure from the Kingdom of England, arranged themselves under a series of leaders who were in many ways supported by the people, whose participation rendered it possible in the end for the Scots to triumph. And through a long period of time, not just the period of the film with William Wallace, but also that of Robert the Bruce, the great warrior king, and Andrew Murray thereafter, and many others, the Scots, in boxing terms, won some great rounds, then were reduced practically to their knees, and somehow made a comeback, came back for a second bout and did much the same thing. They won some very good rounds, and then they were reduced almost to being on their knees. And they came back again and basically changed the balance of power in Northern Europe, and they began the idea of democratic sovereignty. That's a long time ago, but it made a big influence.
What I'd like to do is to get to the present time.
That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing, because these are the four pillars. These are the four pillars. Democratic sovereignty, which changed all of Europe and changed our country because we got that idea from them. The next thing was the revolution in education. The Scots had the largest percentage of literate people and of college graduates or so in the Middle Ages. 4 universities in the Middle Ages in a poor country. 2 colleges in France.
But right now, they have access to oil. That's what I'm trying to come to, that indeed changes the balance of power as you're going through all the different changes in power. Don't they feel that with this access to oil that makes them more powerful, it takes them out of that weak position?
I'll get to the oil, but before we quite get to the oil, we have to understand that the reason that there is an equal treaty between Scotland and England that goes back a long way has to do with all the things I've just mentioned. It was a treaty between 2 equal countries, an international treaty. And the reason it came about is because the English calculated very carefully that it might not be a good idea to invade Scotland because they hadn't had very much success with that in the past. We then go on to the creation of the Industrial Revolution, the second part of it in Scotland, to the Scottish Enlightenment, to the revolution of the Romantic movement, which also began in Scotland. These are all things beginning in a tiny country, a country which was in many ways still, even with its connection with England, an independent country with its own laws, its own religious establishments, its own system of education, its own economic ambiance, and so on and so forth. Now we go fast forward to the period that you're talking about, Smoki. We come to the beginning of the 20th century, when many of the things that you want to hear about were already being proposed before 1900, which are that the Scots would have a parliament, that the Irish would have a parliament, that the Welsh would have a parliament, and then there'd be a general parliament in London. That was called Home Rule all around. It was supported first by Gladstone, then by other people who you know well, the young Winston Churchill, and it became a law. It was passed by
Don't
the
the Scots
Parliament.
always feel there's a bit of condescension on the part of the Brits when they're dealing with Scotland?
Scotland is part of Britain. They are British as much as the English. They're all British.
We know that, but
Right.
indeed, there is a feeling, I've been reading about it, that in fact there is a bit of condescending feeling when the Brits are just, working with the Scots.
Well, it's not the Brits who are working with the Scots. It's the English and the Welsh are not particularly much of a problem in their relations with the Scots. I think the English relations to Scotland have sometimes, perhaps on the English part, involved condescension, but at times also involved insecurity, because the Scots have exerted an influence far beyond their numbers. They helped to found the British Empire. They helped to found the economic structure of Great Britain. They founded the Bank of England, among other things. They created the modern banking system.
What I'm leading up to is that I've been reading that the Scots feel that indeed with their trying to break away, that they've influenced other groups all over Europe that are thinking of doing the same thing. There has been a feeling that they are in a powerful position rather than a weak position.
Well, I think they've always been in a powerful position. I think that history shows that from both their accomplishments and their arrangements with the English. And I think what we're really dealing with is not the breakup of Britain at all, but a shake-up of Britain. And the Scots have shaken Britain up, but it isn't going to fragment, it isn't going to break up into hostile parts. It's simply going to considerably reform itself in ways that we can't entirely predict. But this breakup is emphatically not a this shake-up is not a breakup. That's how it's been represented by certain journalists. But it's really not that way at all.
So you think there's been a misinterpretation of the information that's come out of there and the way the journalists have interpreted it?
Well, I think that some journalists, I think of Stephen Erlanger, who wrote in the New York Times less than 2 weeks ago, who observed that the Scottish referendum has definitely changed considerably the whole situation in Britain, and there'll have to be considerable reform. And this was also predicted by other journalists before the referendum, who said that whether the Scots, quotes, won it or, quotes, lost it, that it would have huge influence not only in Britain, but in Europe, elsewhere, and possibly even in the United States. The other thing is that it is not a never-ending. Somebody was a good wit and coined that phrase that there would always be more referenda and it would go on forever. The Scots are not interested in endless referenda. What they have done is not to create a never-ending, but an up-ending. They have upended the situation in Britain, and now everybody is admitting that all of Britain has to consider serious reform. Many of these reforms, as I said to you earlier, Smoki, were ones that were already contemplated in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. the idea of these
Yeah,
parliaments,
that-
the idea.
I think that is the interesting thing, that indeed nobody has lost here.
I don't think that anyone has lost. The idea really is, I know that America is feeling, or many Americans seem to be feeling very jittery. I sympathize with them. I sometimes feel jittery myself. But I think that we may be exaggerating that so much, whether we're talking about Ebola on the one hand, or some kind of breakup of Britain on the other.
So you feel that ultimately the end result of all this is going to bring about good change that was needed?
I think it's possible. I don't think we should rule it out.
I think that's, the important aspect of the
That's a very
whole
good
thing,
point.
because so many people felt, it was lost, and yet other people feel, no, other things are going to be generated because of this.
Well, it's clear that the Scots did not want to remove everything. They wanted to keep the pound, they wanted to keep their customs union. We have no idea what they would have done in intimate negotiations with the Westminster Parliament. There are a lot of things they probably wanted to keep. They certainly weren't considering changing the Union of Crowns or getting rid of the monarch or anything like that. There are a lot of things they probably wanted to keep, other things they probably wanted to revise, and some things they may have wanted to add. But this is not
there is
breakup,
some
it's shake-up.
Yeah, okay, there's a happy middle ground.
There may be a middle ground
Well, I
here.
think you have explained that to our viewers. Our guest today has been Murray Forbes, and it is the head of the Navigator Foundation. If anybody wants to get in touch with you for lectures or talks or what have you, exhibitions, you have one that is now running at the Groton School. Would you let our viewers know?
Well, the Groton School one unfortunately is over, but the website is www.navigatorfound.org or scotlandcalls.com. I'm a painter. I have shown in Munich, in Krakow, in Florence, and also in Boston and on Channel 2. I believe that artists are also able to contribute things not only through their own work, but by trying, with the help of others, as from you, Smoki, and your wonderful interviews, to do things in the plane of culture that are something beyond their own work.
Murray, thank you very much for all the
Thank you very much.
Murray Forbes 101 on Scotland.